Hi, my name is Cheryl Yoder, and I'm a volunteer with AARP Nebraska. For the month of February, AARP has invited the curator of collections from the Hastings Museum to share 4 informational sessions with us on the topic of quilts. Depending on whom you ask, there are as few as 24 traditional quilt patterns up to over 400. No matter the pattern, one thing is certain. Each quilt illustrates the maker's ability to meld colors and prints together into a cohesive design. Along the way, they may incorporate pieces of a personal story or memory that makes the quilt more meaningful to them or the person for whom they're making it. In this 4-part series, Teresa Kreutzer-Hodson will share the beauty and history of some of the fantastic quilts held in the museum's permanent collection. She will begin today with part 1 of the series by exploring a few of the more commonly known patterns of piece quilts, including the oldest quilt in the collection and a top made by the museum founder's grandmother. You can view this 4-part series on quilts from our AARP Nebraska Facebook page live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time during the month of February. After each event, we will save the recorded segments that we've aired on our Facebook page. Upcoming events on quilts will include part 2 being featured on February 10th, and we'll continue looking at the piece designs of crazy quilts. So many materials have been used to make these eclectic throws. Teresa will share one of the more unique pieces in the collection made from cigar ribbons, as well as some of the fun ways these types of quilts were embellished. Part 3 will be aired on February 17th and will expand on the embroidery methods used in crazy quilts. This episode will also feature a number of signature quilts. In some cases, the signatures were embroidered into the quilt, while others were simply written. One of the more interesting pieces in the collection is a signature quilt featuring names of veterans of the War of 1812, Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. And our final episode will be aired February 24th, and it will shift away from pieced quilts to look at applique quilts. Teresa will end out this series sharing tips on how you can care for your own quilts and keep them preserved for the next generation. If you're watching this segment, please post a comment, like, or share our AARP Nebraska Facebook page so that your friends can watch and learn too. Now, let's get started by meeting Teresa Kreutzer-Hodson from the Hastings Museum. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you so much for hosting our program today. I really appreciate AARP's partnering with the Hastings Museum to bring you some of the quilts that we have in our collection. Just kind of a quick synopsis of today. We're going to talk about piece quilts today. This is our first segment out of 4. We have nearly 80 quilts in our collection. Some of them are in really great condition and some of them are not. So this is a good way to share some of those that we can't display very easily because of their safety. So again, we really appreciate partnering with AARP to bring you this presentation. So let's get started with our pieced quilts today. So there are a lot of different patterns to pieced quilts. Some of them are very old, some of them are very new. Things keep evolving, but there's some basic ones that we have in our collection that I kind of want to talk to you today about. Fabric choices and the way things are put together can make some of the patterns look very different, even though they are the same patterns, which I always find very fascinating. And equally as important to that is the actual quilt stitching. So when I can get a good picture of it, I am going to share some of that because I know, like my mother who likes to quilt, loves to see how other people quilt and how tightly their stitches are together. So I am going to share that for you guys, and hopefully you can see it on your screens. Most of our quilts are they are quilted. We do have some tied quilts, and I didn't go into those today, but we do have a few of the other kinds. We're going to talk mostly about the ones that have been quilted. I'm also not going to go into a lot of detail on the patterns, but I will tell you a little bit of history on a few of them. And basically, I just want to show you what we have and share the history behind the quilts that we have in our collection. So the first group that I want to talk about is log cabin quilts. I just find these so interesting. The lines and the movements just mesmerize me in the various ways that these quilts have been put together. I've really come to appreciate the versatility of these quilts, and I just really wanted to share those with you. The name for these quilts comes from the narrow strip of fabric that are pieced together in layers like a log cabin. They can be very useful when you have very tiny pieces of scrap fabric. It's an efficient use for that scrap fabric. And usually the quilters have worked in light and dark sections to create different patterns. The first one I'm sharing with you today is called Courthouse Steps. It's the way that the blocks are put together. This quilt was made in 1888 or thereabouts, and it has silk and cotton fabric in it. This one has a lot of blocks in it. There are 208 that make up this quilt that's about 60 by 70. It does have some border edgings around it that add to that dimension. This quilt was made by Matilda Craig, and although we don't know a whole lot about her, her husband is really well documented in Hastings history. She married John Craig in December of 1880. They were African Americans and possibly former slaves, which is probably a reason it's difficult to track their early life. We don't really know much about them before they showed up in the Hastings history in about 1880. We don't know how they came to history or came to Hastings, but we do know that John actually was pretty prominent in the community. He started out painting and eventually owned his own laundry facility, and he did billboard poster pasting and stuff for businesses. He also had a roof repair business around town. Like I said, we don't know much about Matilda, but her handwork here is fantastic. This is actually a very shiny quilt. Those silks and cottons that are in there all have a very nice sheen to them. Very detailed, very small blocks, actually. And the other fun thing about this quilt is that you can see her name on the back of it with the date of when she probably finished this quilt. I did take a picture of the edging of this quilt just because it was amazing, all the tiny stitches, which I know is the hallmark of a great quilt maker. The back is also very shiny, as you can see in this picture, piece of satin, and it's just a very pretty, elegant quilt. The next log cabin quilt that I have to share with you is called Barn Raising. And the reason that that has the name for these quilts is because you kind of see that center point that radiates out from the center with kind of rings around that center square. This one is, again, very breathtaking. When you look at it from a distance, you definitely see that concentric pattern, those squares coming out. But when you get closer, then you can really see the detail of each one of those blocks. And there are a wide variety of fabrics that are used in this quilt. Most of them do have blue and white, but there are a few random pinks and purples and yellows in this quilt. This quilt was made somewhere between 1890 and 1900. We do not know who the maker or the history of this quilt. We do know that it's cotton, and it has 80 blocks to make up an 80 by 65-inch quilt. The back on this is very pretty as well. The edging is the lighter white with the smaller blue print, and then the main part of the quilt is that blue that you see over on the right side of your screen. Just looking at these fabrics and stuff, it just makes you so happy to see all of the different patterns and stuff. I love looking at these quilts just to see all that variety that they have. The next quilt that we have is called Straight Furrows. Again, this is another log cabin quilt. And the way that it is done is to give you that striped pattern look. So you see those reds all lining up, those browns and greens lining up. This quilt has 30 blocks. It was made in about 1890, And one of the hallmarks of log cabin quilts for a long time was that small red centered block. When you see a lot of these older log cabin quilts, you will see that red centered block in them. The fabric that was used in this quilt is mostly cotton and wool. Again, we don't know who actually made this quilt, but it is a very well-worn quilt. It was definitely made to be used. I really like the border that they put on this, that striped edging. It's very striking on this quilt. The other thing that I like about this quilt is the back. The back is just as interesting as the front, as I think. Um, these are just big squares of fabric that were sewn together, and there's a wide variety of material that was used and very interesting prints. It's a good example of some of the fabric that was being made at the late 1800s at that time. None of these backings that we've identified have come from sugar sacks, which was something that was used a lot in early quilts. We did have a survey done of our quilts back in the early 90s, and a conservator who is very well knowledged in quilts, Sandy Fox, did a survey and made a lot of notes. And she did not identify any sugar sacks, that's hard to say together, in this quilt. This is another variation of a log cabin quilt. It is called the lover's knot. And it just, like I said, it's another way of piecing these blocks together. Instead of having the concentric square within each one of the blocks, this one starts at one corner and radiates out. This pattern was really difficult to follow, and I think there's about 30 blocks, but it's really kind of hard to tell. They aren't actually uh, parallel when you really start to look at this. And so I kept losing count, but I think there's about 30 in there. This quilt was made in the late 1800s, probably somewhere between 1895 and about 1910. There is silk and velvet. I do think there are probably some used ties in here as well. The quilt itself measures 74 by 55 inches and is actually in very good condition. There are some pieces you'll notice down in the right-hand corner, if you look really closely, there are some pieces that are kind of fraying in this fabric, which kind of indicates that there might have been some weighted silk used in this. Weighted silk was something that was very popular, especially in crazy quilts, which we'll talk about in our next section next time. But weighted silk is known to deteriorate and leave kind of those shreds of fabric. It's just an inherent deterioration of that type of fabric. The back of this quilt is also quite interesting. These are mostly the similar pieces of fabric cut into blocks and pieced together. There's about 3 or 4 that are used. It does have a very nice sheen to it. Because of the deterioration that you see kind of in the center of the backing, you can see some of the stitching on how that log cabin design was stitched down onto that backing fabric. You can also kind of see on that left-hand picture the batting that was used to create this quilt. Stars is another very popular design in pieced quilts, and these are not as easy as some of the other patterns as how to put them together. One wrong cut or stitch can really throw the whole quilt out of whack. These pieces are either cut into diamond shapes or squares, and sometimes triangles. The diamond shapes are pieced together, and that is really the most difficult part to get these star quilts put together. The star patterns really became popular in the late 1800s, and most of our star quilts are from about that time. This particular star quilt is called the Lemoyne Star. It is made with diamond-shaped pieces. There are 8 points to these stars, and it was named after the Lemoyne brothers who helped found New Orleans. This is a very popular style, and you can see it in a lot of the older quilts. This particular one does actually happen to be one of our oldest quilts in the collection. This quilt dates to 1845. It was hand quilted, and there's about 10 stitches per inch, so it's very loosely quilted, but it was made by Sarah Searcy. We don't know a lot about her, but we did get this lovely quilt that she made, and the colors on it are still very vibrant. It's actually in very good condition considering how old it is. There are 63 blocks in this quilt, including the planar blocks that are in between each one of the stars. And the quilt itself measures 81 by 66 inches, so it's a good sized quilt. This quilt is a more recent addition to our collection, but it is an older piece. This one is called the Blazing Star. It uses the Lone Star pattern that has been scaled down so that it's smaller. Lone Stars usually take up the entire quilt, and it's just one star. So this one is multiple stars within the quilt. There are 30 blocks on this one, and they are all hand quilted. It does date to about 1880. We don't know who made this quilt, but we know it was owned by DeWitt and Sarah Palmer, who lived in Hastings in the late 1800s. They themselves have a long history with Hastings. The family would eventually end up donating land that became known as our Prospect Park. It was an area where people could camp, and it was a very popular park in the early 1900s. As you can see, I took a picture of the back of this quilt so you can see some of the stitching. Sometimes it's a little hard to see the quilting that is done from the front side, and the back is where you can really see some of that. Unfortunately, because it's white, I'm sorry, it's a little hard for you to see, but hopefully you can kind of see some of that work that is done on this quilt. The next quilt that we have here is a Feather Star quilt. This one became popular at the end of the Victorian era, and it was kind of a pushback to the dark and heavy colors that were used during the Victorian time. Crazy quilts were something that were very popular, and this was kind of the next stage to kind of break up that busy decor. I do find this one very striking and just very the contrast between the white backing and the star itself is just very appealing. According to our records, Lita Munsell made this quilt in about 1884 while she was living in Omaha. However, there is a stamp on the back that reads Mrs. A.C. Woodward. So we're not quite sure what that means. Perhaps that was somebody that just stamped it, that's who owned it. Just not quite sure where that story comes from. This is a hand-pieced quilt with some machine sewing for the backing. Again, you can see in the images that I have here, you can see some of those quilting stitches and the different designs that are in this quilt. I'll give you just a second to look because there's a lot to look at this one. This next one is not a true star quilt, but the overall appearance, the way the maker put this together, it appears to be a star, but the actual pattern is called a grandmother's flower garden. Like I said, they put it together to look like a star, but the pieces are actually hexagons, and that is the hallmark of the grandmother's flower garden pattern. This pattern was popular in the late 19th century and early 20th century. It uses small fabric scraps cut into hexagons. Many are colorful, which was designed to, or the idea was to lift the spirits in the Depression era of the 1920s. This pattern also has other names like mosaic, honeycomb, or the French bouquet. And we have a couple of these in our collection. Like I said, this one, I loved it because it looks like a star, but it's not a traditional star pattern. And others look more like flowers. So depending on the colors and how it was pieced together, can really change the appearance of this design. Again, this is the backing to kind of show you the quilting patterns that are used. They use kind of a diamond quilting along the edges, and then they outlined each one of those hexagons towards the center. This is a fun piece that we have. It is actually not a completed quilt. It's a quilt top. Never got its batting or its underside finished off. The fabric in this is silk and cotton for the most part. It is hand-stitched blocks into diamonds, which makes it very interesting. If you look at it from an angle, it has kind of a movement to it, and the difference between the diamonds that have the different blocks and the plain diamonds. Give you a little bit of a close-up of some of those diamonds that were pieced together. This quilt was made by Jane Munsell, who put it together in 1891. And the fun thing about this is the grandmother of our museum's founder, Albert Brooking. So it has family ties to our collection and to our founder. Again, this is another quilt that I do think some of these pieces were probably used ties, but not all of them. And there's shiny pieces, there's more matte finished fabrics. So it's kind of an interesting play on the different fabrics that she put together. That'll do it for today for our pieced quilts. Again, I thank AARP for the time that they have given to us to allow us to do these types of programs. We really do appreciate it. It allows us to show you some of our collection. Like I said, we have almost 80 quilts, and we don't have the opportunity to always share these with the communities. So appreciate the time. Come back again for our next segment, which will be crazy quilts, and we'll talk more about those quilts that we have in our collection. Thank you very much. See you next time.